By the end of the 19th century, the globe was a tapestry dyed in the pink of the British Empire. This was the single largest dominion in all of human history. A system of control so total that the sun was literally unable to set on its holdings, from the crowded piers of Hong Kong to the diamond pits of South Africa, from Canada's frozen northern expanses to the sprawling sheep farms of Australia. The authority of Queen Victoria was absolute. Her Royal Navy wielded a global maritime supremacy that had gone uncontested since the age of Napoleon. London was far more than a mere capital. It was the central pump of the world's financial heart, the final ledger for global commerce, and the ultimate arbiter of what passed for international law. For the British ruling elite, the Victorian aristocrats who directed this gargantuan operation from the plush leather seats of their Pall Mall clubs, the world was a settled matter, orderly, hierarchical, and undeniably British. But across the Atlantic, a fundamentally different kind of power was gathering its strength. The United States of America was a nation that the great European powers regarded with a complicated mix of disdain and anxiety. For the better part of the century, the Americans had been dismissed as crude cousins loud, uncultured, and fixated on their own brutal westward conquest. They had wasted years annihilating each other in a civil war, only to turn that violence upon the indigenous tribes of the West to finalize their continental dominance by 1895. However, the frontier was gone. America's internal mission of conquest was finished, and the immense energy that had propelled pioneers across the plains was beginning to look for an external outlet. The United States had been quietly transforming itself. While Great Britain was busy policing its vast and distant colonies, America was constructing factories. Its production of steel had already eclipsed Britain's. Its system of railways was larger than the rest of the world's combined. Its population was surging, fed by an influx of immigrants desperate for work. Here was a sleeping giant, a compressed spring of industrial might that had nowhere to uncoil. The American economy was notoriously unstable, prone to spectacular booms and devastating busts. And the Depression of 1893 had left the nation bitter, agitated, and searching for an enemy. A new spirit of aggressive nationalism was on the rise, a conviction that America had come of age and earned its place at the table of empires. These two tectonic forces, the slow decline of an overextended British Empire and the explosive rise of an oppressant and ambitious American republic, were on a collision course. That collision would not happen in a place of obvious strategic importance, like the Suez Canal or the Straits of Gibraltar. It would happen in a sweltering, mosquito-ridden piece of jungle on the upper edge of South America, a region that on most maps was simply a blank void. The argument between Venezuela and Great Britain was one of those chronic colonial disputes that had simmered for so long. Most officials had forgotten its origins. The problem began during the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain took the colony of British Guiana from the Dutch. The Dutch themselves had never bothered to formally map the colony's western edge because no one saw any value in the deep rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a green hell, a worthless expanse of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and useless. But empires, by their nature, cannot tolerate a vacuum. In 1841, the British Crown commissioned a German naturalist and surveyor, Robert Schomburgk, to chart the colony. Schomburgk drew a line on the map that would become legendary for its audacity, the Schomburgk Line. It deliberately pushed the British border deep into the west, seizing the mouth of the Orinoco River, the main commercial waterway, for all of Venezuela. The Venezuelans, of course, protested. They produced old Spanish maps indicating their claim ran all the way to the Essequibo River. Britain simply ignored them. Venezuela was a chronically weak and unstable republic, perpetually broken by coups and civil wars. Britain was the master of the planet. For 50 years, the disagreement was nothing more than a minor diplomatic annoyance. And then they found gold. In the late 19th century, prospectors struck colossal alluvial gold deposits in the Uruari River area, dead center in the contested lands. Suddenly, that worthless jungle was a treasure chest, the single largest gold nugget ever discovered, weighing an incredible 500 ounces. He was pulled from that very mud. A gold rush exploded, British prospectors and colonists poured into the region. The British government, seeing a chance for massive revenue and a strategic upper hand, not only formalized its claim to the Schomburg Line, but pushed it even deeper, annexing an extra 33,000 square miles of land. To Venezuela, this was nothing short of an existential crisis. The British were not merely grabbing jungle anymore. They were positioning themselves to control the Orinoco Delta, a move that would grant them an economic stranglehold on the entire nation. The Venezuelan government was out of options. They cut all diplomatic ties with Britain in 1887. They begged the other European powers for intervention, but none dared to challenge London. It became clear to Venezuela that it had only one card left in its hand. It had to force the United States into the conflict. To do this, the Venezuelan government retained a former American ambassador, a man named William Scruggs, to work as its professional lobbyist, a master of propaganda. He penned a pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine, on trial. He then blanketed Washington with it, ensuring a copy reached every congressman, senator, and newspaper editor. His case was crafted to be both simple and inflammatory. His charge was that Britain was violating the sacred principle of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine, first declared by President James Monroe in 1823. The doctrine stated that the American continents were no longer to be viewed as territory for future colonization by any European power. It issued a clear warning that any European attempt to export its political system to this hemisphere would be seen as a threat to the days and peace and safety of the United States. For 70 years, the doctrine had been mostly an abstraction. The Relabizes. Navy was far too weak to enforce it against an adversary like the Royal Navy. But Scruggs's pamphlet landed in Washington at the precise moment. When the United States was itching for a confrontation, the man in the White House was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was a Democrat, a conservative, and a man defined by his stubborn integrity, but he was politically cornered. The economy was a wreck. Strikes and riots plagued the country. His party was losing political capital to Republicans, who accused him of being ineffective on foreign policy. Cleveland needed a victory. He had to demonstrate he could stand up for American interests. His Secretary of State was a man named Richard Olney, a corporate lawyer from Boston with a bulldog's disposition and a profound belief in American exceptionalism. He looked at the map of South America, and he saw not a border dispute, but a test of will. If Britain could simply redraw the map of Venezuela whenever it discovered gold, then the Monroe Doctrine was a worthless piece of paper. It would confirm that the United States was not the dominant power in its own hemisphere. During the summer of 1895, Olney sat at his desk in the State Department and composed a diplomatic note to the British government. It was destined to become one of the most renowned and aggressive documents in the history of American foreign relations. In essence, it was a legal brief arguing for American hegemony. In the note, Olney didn't just ask Britain to arbitrate the conflict, he lectured them. He asserted that, quote, "The United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition. Absorb those words, its fiat is law." This was a stunning declaration of dominance, a mechanism designed to inform the British Empire that across the Western Hemisphere, the United States now claimed supreme authority. The logic was absolute. Britain's very refusal to arbitrate the border served as the justification for this power grab, form of aggression, and a breach of the Monroe Doctrine. He demanded an answer. The note was dispatched to London in July of 1895. It landed on the desk of the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, a relic of a past age. He was a bearded, aristocratic titan, a man who practiced diplomacy with the weary cynicism of one who had seen everything, serving as both Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. He saw the United States as a brash, culturally inferior upstart. He read Olney's note with a mix of bemusement and irritation, dismissing its claims as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly observed, was not an element of international law. It was merely a unilateral declaration by a single American president. It had no legal standing in Europe. Salisbury made a mistake. He decided to disregard the note. He let it sit on his desk. He went on holiday. He turned his attention to other matters, in Africa and the Near East. He operated under the assumption that the Americans were just posturing for a domestic political audience. He failed to realize that in Washington, a clock was now ticking. 4 months passed. The silence out of London was deafening, to Cleveland only. This was a calculated insult. It was the British aristocracy looking down, its collective nose at the American Republic. Finally, in late November, the British reply arrived, composed of 2 separate notes. In them, Salisbury systematically dismantled Olney's arguments. He schooled the Americans on history and law. He stated unequivocally that the Monroe Doctrine was irrelevant to a boundary dispute between a European colony and an American state. He rejected arbitration. He refused to yield a single inch on the Schomburg line. The tone was civil, but the message was absolute: mind your own business. When President Cleveland read Salisbury's reply, he was incandescent with rage. He felt personally slighted. The British had not just disagreed, they had treated the United States like a petulant child that required discipline. Cleveland decided to escalate. He chose to drag the issue from the quiet corridors of diplomacy and thrust it into the public square. He decided to threaten war. On December 17th, 1895, Grover Cleveland sent a special message to the United States Congress. The contents of that message hit Washington like a shockwave. In his speech, Cleveland asked Congress to allocate funds to form an American commission to investigate the border dispute. That sounded innocent enough. But then came the ultimatum. Cleveland declared that once the commission established the true border, the United States was obligated to resist with all its might any attempt by Great Britain to claim those lands, viewing it as a deliberate act of aggression against American rights and interests. This applied to any territory we unilaterally decided belonged to Venezuela. Resist by every means in its power. In the lexicon of diplomacy, that is a declaration of war. The President of the United States had just drawn an unmistakable line in the dirt. He was declaring that America would set the border and then fight the British Empire if it dared to step over. The response in America was nothing short of a political firestorm. It was as if a lit match had been tossed into a barrel of gunpowder. The halls of Congress exploded into applause. Republicans and Democrats, locked in vicious battles over domestic policy, were suddenly unified overnight against the ancient foe. The press went into a frenzy. Headlines blared about war with England, proclaiming that the lion was twisting the eagle's tail. For the Civil War generation, who hadn't forgotten Britain's leanings toward the Confederacy, it was a moment of raw, vengeful patriotism. The Irish-American community, a formidable political force, was euphoric at the chance to strike back at the British. Across New York, Boston, and Chicago, massive crowds formed to belt out patriotic hymns. Militia regiments started drilling in public squares. It was a moment of absolute national psychosis. A fever for war consumed the country, ignited by decades of restrained industrial power and burgeoning national pride. The American people were desperate to demonstrate they were no longer a second-tier nation. They were poised to challenge the master of the world's oceans. In London, the bombshell of Cleveland's message landed with the morning papers on December 18th. The British public was utterly baffled. They had paid virtually no attention to the Venezuelan situation, dismissing it as a trivial border dispute in some godforsaken jungle they couldn't locate on a globe. Now, they were opening their newspapers to discover the President of the United States was threatening to overrun Canada and send the Royal Navy to the bottom of the sea. The immediate response in Britain was one of stunned disbelief. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke, a crude political maneuver. They could not fathom why their cousins across the ocean were so incandescent with rage. But as the cables from the British ambassador in Washington started pouring in, the terrifying reality began to set in. This was no stunt. The Americans were absolutely serious. Lord Salisbury convened his cabinet. The atmosphere was grim. As they examined the strategic map, they realized for the first time they were caught in a cage of their own construction. They had fatally underestimated the Americans. They had operated on the assumption that British naval supremacy was so absolute that no nation would ever dare contest it. But as the Admiralty began to calculate the odds, the prospect of a war with the United States took on a horrifying shape. Yes, the Royal Navy was bigger, but its fleet was dispersed across the entire planet, guarding trade routes from the Suez Canal to Singapore. To confront the Americans, they would need to pull the entire fleet into the Atlantic, leaving the rest of the empire completely exposed in Asia and the Mediterranean, and the Americans held advantages no other adversary could claim. Their continent was effectively uninvadable. The entire British army was minuscule compared to the immense manpower reserves of the United States. Canada, the prize of the British Empire in the Americas, was now little more than a hostage. Its 1,000-mile border with the US was a strategic impossibility to defend. If war began, American armies would be in Montreal and Toronto within a matter of weeks, and there was absolutely nothing Britain could do to prevent it. Beyond that, the Americans possessed an industrial base that was simply terrifying. They could manufacture ironclad warships and destroyers at a rate faster than British shipyards could ever hope to match. A conflict with America wouldn't be a brief colonial expedition. It would be a grinding, total war against a nation the size of a continent, with truly inexhaustible resources. But the most pressing danger was not military. It was financial. On Wall Street, the mere whisper of war ignited a panic. On a day that became known as Black Friday, the stock market imploded. British financiers, holding billions of dollars in American railroad stocks and bonds, scrambled to dump them. The financial liquidity of the London market evaporated. The City of London, the very financial core of the empire, delivered an unequivocal ultimatum to the government. A war with our single largest trading partner will bankrupt the nation. The British ruling class suddenly found themselves staring into a void. They were utterly alone. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing, more aggressive by the day. In Africa, the Boers were stockpiling weapons. In the Far East, Russia and Japan were emerging powers. Britain had no allies. It had long celebrated its policy of splendid isolation. Now, that very isolation had become a mortal danger. Lord Salisbury, the same man who had arrogantly dismissed the Monroe Doctrine, was now confronted with the hardest choice of his career. He could hold his ground, fight for the abstract honor of the empire, and trigger a global catastrophe over a worthless tract of jungle filled with mosquitoes and rumors of gold. Or he could swallow his immense pride, concede that the world had fundamentally changed, and submit to the demands of the American upstarts. As Christmas of 1895 drew near, the entire world held its breath. Headlines screamed of warships and invasion plans, while coded messages hummed across the telegraph lines between London and Washington. The British lion was coiled to strike. The American eagle shrieked in defiance. And, for the first time in a century, nobody knew which side would be the first to flinch. In the opening weeks of 1896, the planet held its breath. The United States and Great Britain were trapped in a stalemate that felt destined to erupt into war. The American people were baying for blood, incited by a nationalistic fervor that cast the British Empire not as family, but as an oppressor. The British government, under Lord Salisbury, was backed into a corner, caught between imperial pride and the chilling reality of waging a total war against an industrial behemoth 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. But history often pivots on sheer chance. Just as the confrontation over Venezuela reached its flashpoint, a totally disconnected incident on the far side of the globe manufactured the distraction that ultimately preserved the peace. On January 2nd, 1896, news arrived in London of a debacle in South Africa. A British colonial official, Leander Starr Jameson, had spearheaded a bungled, illegal incursion into the sovereign Boer Republic of the Transvaal. The Jameson raid was an utter fiasco. The British aggressors were captured and publicly shamed. This was humiliating enough. But the next event instantly redrew the geopolitical map in London. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a telegram to the Boer president, Paul Kruger, commending him for driving back the British invaders without having to seek the aid of friendly nations. The Kruger telegram was an explosive device. It was a calculated diplomatic insult to Great Britain. It signaled that Germany was prepared to back the Boers with military force against the British Empire. The British public, whose rage had been fixated on the American threat, suddenly wheeled around in a fury. The hostility toward Washington dissolved, only to be replaced by a searing loathing for Berlin. For Lord Salisbury, this was a providential turn of events. The German menace in Europe and Africa was immediate and severe. The American challenge in Venezuela was, by contrast, a controllable legal squabble. The Kaiser had unintentionally forced Britain to clarify its strategic priorities. The simple truth was that Britain could not afford to fight Germany and America at the same time. Its policy of splendid isolation was no longer splendid. It was a death sentence. Salisbury seized the moment to defuse the crisis with the United States. He wielded the German threat as a pretext to retreat without losing face. He communicated to Washington that Britain was prepared to negotiate. The discussions were fraught, but Britain's new trajectory was obvious. Capitulation. In February of 1896, the British government conceded to the principle. American condition? They would allow the Venezuela border conflict to be settled by a neutral arbitration body. This was the blink. After months of vowing, Her Majesty's government will never submit. They submitted. They consented to the American Commission. They conceded the principle that the United States possessed the authority to intervene. To save face, British negotiators held out for a few minor conditions. They stipulated that any British settlers who had occupied the contested zone for 50 years would be permitted to remain, irrespective of where the new boundary was established. The Americans, anxious to claim a victory without a fight, concurred. It was a fig leaf designed to obscure the British withdrawal, but everyone understood what had transpired. The Monroe Doctrine had just been enforced by the threat of violence. The arbitration committee that convened in Paris in 1899 was a bizarre piece of theater. It was the final scene of the crisis. But all the tension had long since dissipated. The committee was composed of 2 British judges, 2 American judges who represented Venezuela's interests because the British refused to be seated with Venezuelans, and a neutral Russian diplomat. When the verdict was finally delivered, the irony was unmistakable. The tribunal granted Britain nearly 90% of the territory in question. The Schomburg Line was mostly affirmed. The gold fields of the Uruguay remained in British possession. Britain may have gotten the land, but the United States got the hemisphere. The precise coordinates of the border were inconsequential. The precedent was everything. Britain had formally admitted that. It could no longer act independently in the Americas. It had recognized that Washington was the ultimate authority in the Western Hemisphere. This event signaled the start of a fundamental change in British global strategy, which historians now call the Great Rapprochement. The British establishment, profoundly rattled by the crisis, undertook a brutal reappraisal of its international standing. They observed the rising might of Germany in Europe, the advance of Russia across Asia, and the industrial detonation occurring in the United States. They grasped that the Victorian period of easy supremacy had ended. They had to choose their battles. They concluded that the United States was the one power they could not vanquish and therefore had to befriend. If you are unable to defeat them, you must align with them. This was not a sentimental calculation, rooted in common language or ancestry. It was the cold, hard logic of realpolitik. The British understood that American economic muscle was becoming the pivot point for the entire global system. The British elite realized that an alliance with Washington was the ultimate insurance policy for preserving their global empire. This recognition triggered a systematic campaign of appeasement. Over the following decade, Britain began a deliberate liquidation of its strategic holdings in the Western Hemisphere, handing them over to American control. Piece by piece, the Panama Canal was the first asset to be sacrificed. For 50 years, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had locked both Britain and the U.S. into a partnership, stipulating that any canal crossing Central America had to be a joint Anglo-American venture. This was designed to prevent either side from monopolizing the critical trade artery. But in 1901, the United States tore up the old agreement. They demanded to build the canal alone, to own it exclusively, and to militarize it. In a previous era, such a demand would have been unthinkable for Britain to accept. Dominating the world's commercial choke points, was the very essence of British imperial power. But this time, London simply folded. They ratified the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which ceded to the United States the sole right to build, operate, and control the Panama Canal. Britain's compensation for this was zero. No new territories, no financial payments. They voluntarily surrendered the most strategic waterway of the 20th century. It was a calculated offering of peace, a clear admission that the Caribbean had functionally become an American sea. Next came the military drawdown. For 200 years, the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies Squadron had been the undisputed symbol of British dominance in the Americas, operating from bases in Bermuda, Halifax, and Jamaica. Its warships had projected British power along the coastlines. In the opening years of the 20th century, first Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher made a game-changing decision. He ordered the squadron home. The aging gunboats were scrapped, and the modern battleships were redeployed to face down the rising German naval threat in the North Sea. Consequently, Britain's Caribbean bases were hollowed out, and their garrisons were stripped to skeletal crews. This was the effective demilitarization of Britain's frontier with the United States. It was a calculated wager that defending Canada or Jamaica from an American attack was no longer necessary. The Americans themselves were now the region's de facto security force. This strategic retreat created a power vacuum, one the United States moved to fill instantly. In 1898, a mere 3 years after the Venezuela crisis, Washington initiated the Spanish-American War. The Americans drove Spain from Cuba and seized Puerto Rico for themselves. It was an undisguised act of imperial conquest. And what was Britain's response? Did London protest this land grab? Did they attempt to block American colonial expansion? On the contrary, Britain was the only major European power to unequivocally support the United States. As France and Germany expressed sympathy for Spain, Britain openly championed the American cause. The British press celebrated the U.S. victory, while British diplomats worked behind the scenes to keep other European powers from getting involved. A new world order was being born. Britain was effectively outsourcing the security of the Western Hemisphere to Washington. This new power dynamic was put on trial again in 1902 with the second Venezuela debt crisis. Indeed, Venezuela was once more in financial chaos. The country's dictator, Cipriano Castro, flatly refused to repay his debts to European creditors. In response, Britain, Germany, and Italy dispatched naval flotillas to blockade the Venezuelan coastline. They bombarded several forts and captured gunboats to compel Castro to pay. President Theodore Roosevelt observed these actions with intense suspicion. While he had no issue with Europeans collecting their debts, he feared Germany would use the crisis as a pretext to establish a permanent territorial foothold in South America. Roosevelt delivered a stark warning. He established what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the United States would henceforth serve as an international police power for the Western Hemisphere. If any Latin American nation created a problem, they would intervene directly, making European interference unnecessary. Roosevelt quietly told the Germans to withdraw, and he issued the same caution to the British. Britain's reaction was a study in submission. Rather than contest the point, they immediately recalled their warships. They yielded to Roosevelt's authority. The British Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, even publicly announced that his government would welcome the United States, assuming the role of regional policeman. We should welcome any increase of the influence of the United States of America in the Western Hemisphere, he declared. This was a stunning 180-degree reversal from the position of 1895. In just 7 years, Britain had transitioned from threatening war over a remote border dispute to actively inviting the Americans to police the entire continent. The outcome of this great rapprochement would shape the 20th century. By choosing appeasement over conflict in 1895 and cultivating a role as America's junior partner, Britain had secured the most powerful ally imaginable. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Britain was on the verge of financial collapse within 2 years. As detailed in our prior episodes, only American loans and American industrial output enabled Britain to continue the fight. Had the Venezuela crisis ended differently, Had the two powers remained locked in hostility, the United States might well have remained neutral, or perhaps even thrown its weight behind Germany. Instead, the special relationship that was forged in the crucible of Britain's humiliation in 1895 ultimately saved the nation from total defeat. But it was the nation that was saved, not the empire. The Venezuela crisis was the moment of transfer. It wasn't a dignified ceremony. It was a cold, hard confrontation. The British Empire stared directly at the American Republic and saw its own obsolescence. It saw a power with superior steel, more abundant coal, a larger population, and deeper pockets. Faced with this undeniable math, it made the only logical decision to yield. The psychic shock to Britain's ruling elite was seismic. They began a process of self-redefinition, no longer as global masters, but as the wise Greeks to America's ascendant Romans, a comforting fiction designed to guide the crude new hegemon. It was a necessary myth to rationalize their own irreversible decline. For Venezuela, the outcome was bitterly ironic. They were rescued from British ambition only to be trapped by American dominance. The United States would control their government and their oil for the next 100 years. The true purpose of the Monroe Doctrine was laid bare. It was never about shielding Latin America from imperialism. It was a design to guarantee that the only imperialism in the hemisphere would be American-made. Even now, if you go to the borderlands between Guyana and Venezuela, you find a wild, haunting beauty. The jungle has swallowed the forgotten mining outposts, but that invisible boundary cut through the wilderness is a fault line in history. It is the precise point where the 19th century was executed and the 20th was born. It is the ground where the British Lion surrendered its power. It is the place where America realized it could issue commands to the planet, and the planet would have no choice but to comply. The 1895 crisis is the secret origin story of our modern world. It is proof that the most consequential conflicts are the ones that are never waged. Great Britain forfeited the Western Hemisphere without firing a single shot. But in that act of submission, it secured a very alliance that would allow it to endure the coming cataclysms. It was a deeply humiliating retreat, but it was also arguably the most brilliant strategic concession in the empire's entire history. An entire continent was lost, but their nation was preserved. And in the unforgiving, zero-sum game of empires, sheer survival is the only form of victory that truly matters. Subscribe now to understand the system, because when the official story is finally written, you will want to be one of the few who always knew how it was truly designed.